Hey, my name is Roy Townsend. I grew up in Lanett, Alabama. I was born on September the 15th, 1942. I attended Auburn University and moved to Atlanta as soon as I graduated, and obviously have been here ever since. My titles at Emory Clinic, where I started as controller in 1969. Within a couple of years, I added the title of assistant to the director. And then in 1984, I was named the executive administrator, which was the title I kept until I retired. Well, it's an interesting story. I spent 4 years at Georgia Power, and I was in what they call a management trainee program. And a number of people were in each class as it went through, and it was a 3-year program. And this particular gentleman named Henry Cray and I took jobs before the training program ended. We stayed at the 270 Peachtree, and I was in what they called operating reports, and he was in data processing. And after a few years, we decided that that really was not where we wanted to spend our careers. And so we made a vow that whoever goes somewhere first will call the other. Henry went to Emory University as the administrator of the psychiatry department and called me and said there was an opening at that particular time this was 1968, there was an opening for the Department of Medicine administrator job, and I applied for that job. And because of Emory Clinic's relationship with the university and a guy named John Outlaw, who was the HR director at the time, he sent my resume to Barney Chisholm, who was the business manager, and he called me and said, well, I know that job at Emory, if you will, is not available any longer, but I'd like to talk to you about being the controller of the Emory Clinic. And I jumped at the opportunity, and the rest is history. Well, the opportunity that being the controller of Emory Clinic at that time, it was relatively small. There were 110 doctors and maybe 300 employees, and I would be responsible for the entire accounting department and those functions. And at Georgia Power, I felt like, I was just one little piece of this huge cog, and so it just seemed like an opportunity. I have an accounting degree, and that's really what I wanted to focus on. And as it turned out, I even did many more things, which was even better. But that was the main thing. It offered that opportunity. Not really. I mean, once again, we were fairly small. And Barney Chisholm, I guess, if you will, taught me the ropes of the position. But when I got there, there was not a controller. In fact, the person that had that job had actually already left for a job, I think, in Tennessee. So I learned a lot on the go and using, some experience through college and some, things that you learn, like in the training program at Georgia Power. I went through a lot of the accounting departments and functions. There are a number of them that I spent a lot of time working with. When I got there, Dr. Robert Brown was the clinic director, and I guess there was 7 or 8 that were still there. As you know, 2 or 3 of them left in the first year of the formation of the clinic in 1953, but most of the rest of them were there, and I worked with them on committees and what have you, and very interesting group of people. Well, Dr. Brown, as I said, was the clinic director, and basically we, the administrative staff, reported to him. And so his primary function at that time was, if you will, as the director, kind of like the CEO. And he was Marcus Welby, okay? He was a handsome, white-haired gentleman with so much poise and pleasing, calming personality that it was amazing. Very easy to work with, very much a detailed person though, in which I tend to have found that surgeons are more like that. Dr. Bruce Logue was another example who just was a dynamo. I mean, he just was always active, and he was always supportive of things that we would try to do. Dr. Sam Wilkins was another surgeon in what we call now the Winship Clinic. Always complained about parking. We never had a meeting that he didn't talk about the issues with parking, which obviously still exist. Dr. Schroeder was a very fine gentleman. He was a gastroenterologist, and at one point was the acting section head in internal medicine. And so through that position, I worked very closely with him. Dr. Hurst, as chairman of medicine, I knew pretty well, once again, serving on committees with him, a very nice gentleman. The entire group were just really dynamic people, and you can, as you look back, you can see why they were successful in building the clinic, because they all had this ideal of teaching and patient care and, if you will, the three stools of what we were all about: teaching, research, and patient care. Well, the reason for forming the clinic, I think, was twofold. One is that Mr. Woodruff, who was supporting the medical school, was underwriting losses every year, and he wanted some way to make an investment, if you will, that would perpetuate the growth and the continuation of the medical school, but without him having to pick up that fund every year or that loss. And so the idea was, if we've got these doctors that are all individually practicing, and it was basically out of offices in the hospital, that is there a way to do that? And if he would give the money to build a building, and the clinic would in essence pay rent for that building, then the university would be clear that money that they could support the medical school. And that is a simplification of what happened, but that was basically the reason. There's a way to self-sustain the medical school and then allow for the continued growth of the medical school and the clinic. Basically, they had offices in the hospital. Yes, I've always understood it was in the basement, and they all did their own billing, and so you can easily see where that if we can get together, the laws of economy come into play, and that's really where they were going. It's my understanding the private diagnostic clinic was just a few of those doctors that, I think it was in internal medicine, but others, like the doctors in cancer, had their own practices. So I think the private diagnostic was just one little component, and it kind of melded into the clinic. I don't think so, because even today, there's not another Emory clinic anywhere around. And so I think as the story I heard, that Mr. Woodruff had a committee put together that went out around the nation looking at models. And the Oxner Clinic was one. Of course, Duke University Clinic was in existence. And they kind of just took the best of those worlds and then put the clinic structure together, which was a partnership. Obviously, when this whole thing took place in 1953, there was a lot of, if you will, animosity from the physicians in town. And it took some time to get over that struggle. And back in those days, the clinic became was a referral-only clinic, and that lasted for many years to try to ease some of those tensions with the town doctors, if you will. Well, I think that they first off thought, and I'm relating stories that I've heard, because once again, I joined the clinic 16 years after the foundation was laid. But I think they thought that Emory was going to be able to provide the facilities rent-free, and the doctors in the clinic would have have an advantage over them, and that they would be more competitive because they wouldn't have that cost. Now, what the piece they missed was the clinic paid rent just like the doctors in town did, and they paid a rent that was based on community rates and everything. And I think there was this whole issue of corporate practice of medicine just not being what should be done, and they saw that as a corporate practice of medicine. So I think those were the real issues, and took a long time to get over all of them. Well, in the early years, the clinic was, as I said, a private partnership, and so it functioned very, very independent. Now, the physicians all had joint appointments. They had to be faculty members in order to be a member of the clinic, and that still exists today. But the clinic had its own payroll, its own HR department, its own billing system, and so there was a lot of independence, but a good relationship with the university. And we reported, and once again I say we reported everything we were doing to the university through the dean, and everything that was going on in the clinic was known by the university. So I think the relationship was good. It was just a very independent arrangement. Well, over time, and I think the year probably was 1997, there was the formation of, I guess, the Emory Healthcare as it is today. And all the components that delivered healthcare were brought under that umbrella. And so I don't know exactly how to legally describe it, but the clinic is now a part of the university through Emory Healthcare. So in a sense, some of that independence is gone, but I think it makes for, in today's world, with healthcare as it is, with managed care and all that, it's a much better arrangement, and it gives the clinic the muscle, if you will, of the entire university, joined with the hospital and everything. The good old days were, I think, the fact that the growth of the clinic was just, I just have to say, phenomenal. And that's what was so exciting about being there. And some of the things that we would do, when I first got there in '69, we were small enough that we could have a Christmas party and invite everybody. And so we would have one big function. Nowadays, and even as shortly after I got there, if you will, it became so large that all that had to be fragmented because you just couldn't do it as one large group. And so we did a lot of things that would be kind of like family things. And as you grow, obviously you just can't continue to do all that. And so that family feeling was one of the things that I always enjoyed. And you kind of knew everybody, and things just kind of worked a little differently. Well, of course, space. I mean, when I got there in 1969, they had already taken the original building, which was basically half of what you see when you face the clinic from Clifton Road. They had added what we call the south wing. They had added an east wing, and so it looked like a T. And when I got there, they had added the second wing of the north piece of the clinic. And one of my favorite stories is that they don't always tell you what you're going to do when you take a job. And so the first day, I think it was the first day, maybe the second day, a truck pulls up in the back of the clinic, a semi, and I'm told that, well, there's the truck, and that's all the furniture that goes in that new wing, and that's where your office is going to be, so you need to help unload the truck. And so that was kind of an interesting experience I wasn't exactly expecting, but once again, it was fun to be part of that and to see all that taking place. So I think the need because we were growing so fast, you had to have somewhere to accommodate all that. You know, I didn't work too closely with the nurses, but there's two that stick out in my memory, and I even remember their names. And the first is Jackie Martin, who was a nurse, and she ran the clinic lab. And we worked very closely with her in all sorts of issues, billing issues, but also the lab moved a number of times with different projects that we had where we were expanding. And her assistant was a nurse named Mavis Morrison. I don't know why these names come to me, but that's two that I do remember. And I don't recall names, but as we, once again, built additional space, nurses were very much involved with helping work with our architects and what we need and what kind of office space and support space and all. I don't know who the first one might have been, but I know that in 1969 there was a Dr. Marion Olansky who was a pediatric dermatologist, and her husband was Dr. Sid Olansky, who was an adult dermatologist. And I remember her so clearly and so well, and she was a really outgoing person and very much involved with the pediatric side of things. So she's the first one that I recall encountering. A couple of other people just remembering names. There was a Dr. Susie Tyndall, who was a neurosurgeon, and she was very outspoken, if you will, very much involved with the clinic. She was on a number of committees and had a lot of good ideas, and I just would call her a dynamo, and she's somebody you would remember. I did know Luella. Once again, in OBGYN, right? But didn't have much direct contact with her except through what we had back in those days, what we called the administrative committee. And the chiefs of all the services were basically the members of that committee. And so I knew her through that. Successes? Oh, I think that it's continued growth once again. I mean, we became basically the clinic, certainly in the South, and could compete with the Oxners and the Dukes and even the places in the Northeast. We participated in administrative arena in national organizations, and Emory's reputation was known throughout the country. And so when we would go participate, people would want to know what we were doing, and that was always a nice feeling that we must be doing something right. And I think that the way we were able to then work with the town doctors as well as get over those issues, and I think that was a big success. And all those issues kind of went away, and we competed, obviously, and still do. But I think that was a success to make that happen. Well, when I left, there were like 850 doctors, and I understand they've got about 1,100 now. So I guess the future is more growth. And with the bringing in the Johns Creek Hospital and the St. Joseph, I think that sort of thing may continue because I believe there's strength in the largeness of the organization as you have to deal with competition, as you have to deal with the insurers, with managed care and all the issues with the Obama health care program. I think that Emory is positioning itself to be a leading provider, which they are, and to continue to be that. There were never any contributions directly to the clinic, and the main reason for that is because it was a private partnership, and so that would not be something you could do with tax structure. So all the contributions were through the university, and the university therefore owned all of our equipment, all of our buildings and everything else, and so we, quote, rented, if you will, all of that. And Mr. Woodruff, of course, was the obvious donor for most of that. Nowadays, if you will, since the clinic became a 501c3 corporation in, I think, 1993. Pretty sure that's correct. Technically, the clinic could receive contributions, but once again, because of the overall structure of Emory Healthcare, contributions typically, certainly from the Woodruff Foundation, go to Emory Healthcare, not to the Emory Clinic. Absolutely. Yep. And once again, the goal was that, okay, I can make this $1 million investment and I won't have to keep making these whatever amounts that they were that every year he was having to write a check for. And I've been told that from that time, there was never a deficit in the medical school again. So the system worked and still is. I mean, I'm certain it's different to some extent from a technical basis, but still basically the idea is the same. When the clinic was formed, there were very few, if you will, organized clinics. There was, we talked about Oxnard and Duke, but those were affiliated with medical schools. In private practice, there was the Harbin Clinic in Rome, and then there was a clinic in LaGrange and Clark Holder, right? And one of the things that we did was that I mentioned some of the administrative organizations. We set up in 1970, or actually no, 1968, the Georgia Medical Group Administrators. And the clinic was obviously by far the largest of those groups. But once again, we were 100 and something doctors. I think Clark Holder had maybe 30 and Harbin maybe 30 or something like that. But that was a very good operation, if you will, where we shared ideas because we still did a lot of the same thing that each other did, a lot of the same things. And so we could share what we were doing, what was working, what was not working. And just because Emory being who it was, we were, I think, a leader in making that organization grow. And it now has about 160 clinics from around the state. And they still meet periodically. And I was fortunate enough to be president one year, so that was fun. So I think Emory gave me a lot of opportunities that I never dreamed of having. In fact, I met my wife in a Medical Group Managers Association meeting, so dear to my heart. She was a manager of an OBGYN group at Northside. I think they have like 10 doctors. I worked for Bob Brown, who was the clinic director, Charlie Hatcher, who was the clinic director, Garland Patu, who was the clinic director, Rain Sorrell, who was the clinic director. I never worked for Doug as clinic director, but I served on, I can't tell you how many committees with him, and also on Wright, with Wright Kaufman. So I had the opportunity to work with all those guys, and I just can't say enough about how just incredible they were. Just so nice to work with them and work for them and to participate in whatever you might have as a part of the clinic's growth. It was an important part, and they recognized that. So that was just always something I enjoy, and when I think about that, that's an opportunity a lot of people don't have to go through all of that. Basically, the dynamic of how can we structure something that will, in essence, continue growth and, if you will, growth without somebody else having to pick up the tab. And it was an investment. It was Mr. Woodruff was a person who thought that way. I mean, the whole idea of having to cover a loss was just not something he was particularly interested in. And so this was an opportunity. And as I said, they sent a committee out and they went all over the country and they came back with this particular structure. Randolph Thrower was, I think, on that committee. He was with Sutherland, Asbel, and Brennan, and they ended up writing the first partnership agreement. That would have been 1953. Okay. Yeah, because the first clinic building didn't open until I think late 54 or early 55. But the partnership agreement was actually written in I think it was January of 1953. I can't tell you how many times I had to read it. So I used to almost have it memorized. One of the terms that were always thrown around was the 3A payment and the 3B payment. These were things that the clinic made to the university, and people would say, well, what is that? And it took me a while to figure it out, but 3A was paragraph 3A in the partnership agreement, which spelled out this payment that we make for rent, and 3B was another piece of that, and I'm going, okay, so that's what that means. There was a succession of them, and so we had to have each and every one, because as an example, the clinic, when I first got there, was Emory University Clinic. And we changed the name. I can't remember exactly, but it was one of the things Dr. Hatcher wanted to do, because there was so much confusion with Emory University Hospital and Emory University sending bills to people for different things, and Emory University Clinic. So we said, hey, why don't we just become the Emory Clinic? It's so much easier. And so we, quote, changed the name. All the partners had to sign it. That document then superseded the other one. And then as we grew, there was a time when, of course, Mr. Woodruff had given the huge sum of money to the clinic, and he was not really available to build new buildings for us. And so the clinic worked out with the university where the doctors would basically fund the new building with a different facility payment. So a lot of that growth was funded by the physicians themselves. Certainly initially, Mr. Woodruff gave the first wing, the second wing, third wing, I don't know how many along the way. There's just all sorts of things that you can do if you're agreeable to, and the different people you meet and the different interactions. And I think that's part of academia, I guess. And so I was delighted in 1990, the dean gave me an appointment in the medical school. It didn't mean a whole lot, but it did to me. And so, although I didn't consider myself a teacher, but just to know that, you know, I had the dual appointment just like the physicians did, it was kind of neat. That was the other thing too, working with all the different deans, and going back to Richardson, who served forever and ever. I think he didn't like the independence of the clinic, and the clinic exerted its independence quite a bit. And so I think that was somewhat of a sore point with him. But then after he was gone, there was a succession of different deans, and our relationships got better, obviously, over time. And with Tom Lawley, I couldn't pull up his name, but Tom was, to me, the best dean because he was so easy to work with. And of course, he had also been the chairman of dermatology, and that always, I thought, added a little bit of understanding to the clinic side of things, because he'd worn that hat of being a chairman, and so that was interesting too. The space is a premium. I mean, you need it for so many things, and so what do you do? That was a struggle we had all the time. We could never build enough, and but you had to just do what you could and try to at least, I mean, we literally would get a wing finished and occupied, and we already were talking to the architect because we filled it immediately. Yeah. And so that's one of those things I think that's unique about the clinic. And Dr. Scarborough was really smart. I'm sure you heard the story about why the original building was lopsided. He built this, what we call the north wing, and it had the tower at the end of it. And the story I heard, and I got this from Garland Purdue, and I think he might have been there. He was not a partner, but he was a fellow at Emory doing a vascular fellowship. And the story was that Mr. Woodruff would come to campus every Sunday and ride around and look at things. And they finished this clinic building, and he had Dr. Scarborough with him, and he said, "Elliot, that building is lopsided. What in the world's wrong with it?" And he said, "Well, Mr. Woodruff, it won't be lopsided when you give me the money to build the other wing, and that tower will be in the middle." And the story I heard was that he took out his checkbook and wrote his check and said, "Here, Elliot, build your damn building." And that's how the second wing came about. that's kind of neat. I think that was one of my favorite stories, and I was not there, but it's passed on to me many times. I actually met Mr. Woodruff one time, and I met him in an elevator, and he was actually in a wheelchair at that time and was going up to see, I think it was Dr. Seavey, and so I got introduced to him, and that was it. That was enough. I mean, you could feel his presence, though. I mean, he just was such an incredible person. I mean, and of course, I had heard so much about him all the years. I don't know if you ever knew Dr. Paul Seavey, but he was one of my heroes too. He was my physician, as well as I worked closely with him. And when he became the section head of the internal medicine department, actually in the clinic we called them sections, and they were departments in the school. But he was the section head of the clinic, and we worked closely together for a long, long time. And he said one day, he said, "Roy," he said, "I have been trying my best for a year to find you wrong in something that you've done, and I haven't, but I'm not going to give up." Okay, that's kind of a hard model to meet, but he was serious. I mean, he was a very detailed person too, and oh man, I mean, he'd question me, and so fortunately, I seemed to always have the right answer. But you couldn't let your guard down, and so kept you smart and sharp. Actually, no, I got my nickname from my brother. Uh, he was uh, he was a much better athlete than I ever was. He was 6 years older than me, and they had a football banquet, and obviously he had dressed to kill, and the coach said, "Look at Razor," and that stuck with him. And I was 6 years younger, and when I came along in high school, that coach was still there, and they just named me Razor too. And so that's where I got that Razor Roy. Anyway, when the clinic was 25 years old, we had a 25th anniversary party at the Piedmont Driving Club. And there are photos of that somewhere, because I remember this. One thing that jumps out at me is Charlie Hatcher dancing with a physician who was a nephrologist. I can't think of her name right now. But anyway, and that was a gala event, and we had a wonderful time. I mean, almost every physician came. The spouses were obviously invited, and we shut down the Piedmont Driving Club for the Emory Clinic's 25th. And I was able to serve, because of Dr. Hatcher. He asked me to serve on the planning committee with Dr. Ambrose, Dr. Hindy, and I've forgotten who else now. But anyway, that was a very interesting and neat experience to do something that different from working at the clinic itself, but just meeting the spouses were involved, and so we had a great time. And you could do things like that then. I was somewhat disappointed at the clinic's 50th anniversary that they didn't really seem to do very much, and I don't know what was going on. Who knows? I mean, the world was changing a lot at that time. Uh, the other, to me, interesting story is that I became really good friends with Dr. Perdue when he was clinic director, and I've still maintained my relationship with Dr. Hatcher. We're best of friends, but with Dr. Perdue, we traveled a lot together, socially and just for fun trips, and we went to Europe for a couple of trips and just had a great time. And he was just such a wonderful, fun person, and he, in essence, used to tell me, he said, "But sometimes, Roy, I just like to get away from doctors, and you're not a doctor, although you know a lot about them, but we can have a lot of fun, and we don't have to worry with them." So that was kind of interesting, and unfortunately, he died about, oh gosh, about 7 or 8 years ago, I guess, and I still see his wife. We get together at least once or twice a year. But he was, don't know if you know much about his history, but he was there when the clinic was formed. He was a fellow and worked very closely with Dr. Scarborough, and he told me that Mr. Woodruff used to call him boy. And he would tell Dr. Scarborough, says, "Get that boy over here. I've got something on my face that needs to be cut off." And so he was the boy, but he knew Mr. Woodruff, really well because of all that. And so some of those people were just very interesting characters. He had gone in the Army when he was 16 years old, served in Germany, and this was toward the end of the war. But he was actually, what was really interesting about him, we went to Germany once, and we went to this place called Aachen, and there's a big cemetery there. And to watch him, we just kind of left him alone, and he went over to this area, and he was reading names of people that he had fought with, and it was unbelievable. But then we went to Switzerland, and we didn't meet, but we walking down the street, and this guy had such an unbelievable memory. He said, "I remember in 1945, I went up that street right there with so-and-so, and we had dinner in this little restaurant." And I'm going, I can't believe that. And this happened all the time. I mean, just had a phenomenal memory. And we were driving through these woods in Germany. And he said, "I remember," he said, "Pull over, Roy." I was driving. He said, "Pull over." He said, "I remember," and this was really interesting because he said, "I remember this particular spot." He says, "We were trying to get from that side of the road to this side of the road, and there were 18 of us, and 3 of us made it." And to hear him talk about all that. So anyway, so he got out of the Army, came back to Emory, went to medical school at Emory, and he also spent some time at Hopkins, and that's where he met Dr. Hatcher. And he was very instrumental in getting Dr. Hatcher interested in coming to Emory. So a lot of tie-ins like that. That's my last story.